Welcome to the Spirit Experience Podcast, where we discuss spiritual practices for healing and happiness. I'm your host, Schall Adams, a spiritual life coach with a focus on transforming grief into a life of purpose. Join us each Monday for enlightening conversations with spiritual teachers across a variety of practices and modalities. My guest this week on the Spirit Experience Podcast is Aliye Aydin. Aliye discovered her passion for cooking as a healing tool when she was a teenager after a scary health diagnosis. After attending culinary school in her late 20s, Aliye worked in various professional kitchens as a culinary instructor and started and ran an organic produce home delivery business for 8 years. After a spiritual awakening 2 years ago, Aliye started exploring spiritual practices, beginning with the Sufi tradition of her childhood. She is also a certified facilitator in spiritual literacy and transformative practices. Aliye has brought together her love of cooking with her spiritual practice to help her clients with healing mind, body, and spirit. Aliye, welcome to the show. I am very excited to have you here today.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
I went through the Spirituality and Practice website, and I have some questions for you about spiritual literacy and how you came to practice it in your own life.
So I came across the alphabet of spiritual literacy a couple of years ago. It was fed to me on wherever, Facebook or wherever, and it was a course that was being offered by this website called Spirituality and Practice. And the two people behind the website are actually a couple that were a long time in the Methodist Church. They're since retired, but they wrote a book back in the 90s called The Alphabet of Spiritual Literacy: Reading the Sacred in Everyday Life. And in this book are 37 words or concepts that they had pulled out from their religious and spiritual studies over the years of being in the Methodist Church. And these were words or concepts they have found present in most world religions and spiritual traditions. So this was the basis of the book that they wrote in the 90s, and they have since created a course. I think they're in their third or fourth year of the online course, administered not by the couple itself, but actually they have a Sufi teacher who administers these concepts. And it's a year-long course. And you go through, the words are things like attention and being present and compassionate and devotion and faith. And you can imagine it does go A through Z, and it has a few extra ones, obviously, than the 26-letter alphabet. But basically, I spent a year going through these words and attending a weekly lecture and a weekly small group discussion and reading lots of resources and quotes and book excerpts and getting as deep as I wanted into it to discover these words of spiritual literacy. And how I got to it, I mean, spirituality is always something that has appealed to me. I was raised by a father who was Sufi, so I was exposed to Rumi poetry at an early age. It's something that was really in me, but a few years ago, I really had this dark night of the soul moment that came out of a betrayal in my relationship. And I was looking for something deeper, along with turning 45 or so. That all happens at once, right? So I was looking for something a little bit deeper, and I stumbled upon this course. And since it was a gateway for me to get deeper into something that I'd always wanted to, but it hadn't been time before, and I hadn't known how, really, because religion had never really spoken to me, yet spiritual concepts had. So this spiritual Alphabet of Spiritual Literacy course, run by somebody who I resonated with on a deep level because of the Sufi background, was really the perfect fit for me. Dr. Habib Burger, he's an incredible teacher and has a really fascinating backstory himself. So just really all those combinations coming together really set the stage for me to dive into these concepts. And in the class, I mean, there's people, Christian people practicing, Buddhists, people of no religion, just anybody and everybody coming in together to explore what these words mean in their life and how can they apply them to their everyday life.
That's beautiful. You had talked about mindfulness the last time we spoke, and that's one of the concepts in the spiritual literacy practice. Are the words in themselves something that can be thought of as a practice, that something you can build a practice around? And when you apply them in your life, how does it affect the whole?
Mhm. So, yeah, I think absolutely you can build a practice around them. And that's actually how the class itself was run. So, every week was focused on one word, and you were encouraged to, they would present 7 or 8 or more different spiritual practices that ranged anywhere from say one word when you wash your hands to contemplate something much, much deeper. So you got to pick if it was something very simple for you or something much, much deeper, and then practice that thing every single day of the week. So throughout that, I found myself transforming in relationship to these words. A lot of these concepts I had never thought much about beyond a very surface level meaning. So I was able to develop even discover what I knew or felt about these words or what my experience had been. And that this was the encouragement in the class to journal about this. And we had to turn in our journaling just to show that we were going through the material. So it's absolutely something that a practice can be based on. But I think also you mentioned the mindfulness piece. For me, it was necessary before I practiced any of these things to come to a place of mindfulness first. At first glance, these spiritual practices, if you're not in the right space to receive them, can almost seem kind of trite in a way. Like I'm supposed to hold a cup and say, "Oh Lord, fill my cup." I mean, who does that? If you're
Right.
coming from that space, you're like, "What's this going to give me?" But if you take a moment to take a few breaths and settle within yourself and drop in, as we used to call it, go to that place where is calm for you. And it's called many different things by many different people. And then kind of contemplate from that space. That's what I found myself needing to do as someone who came to a program that didn't really have a regular spiritual practice at all. And I had struggled for years with finding something. And throughout this course, I was exposed to many different spiritual practices and was able to figure out what worked for me and what resonated with me. And what was so great about the course is that there was a lot of encouragement to not push the material away if it didn't resonate with you in its terminology, but rather to find a like if the teacher would say the word God, he would say, I'm using the word God here. If the word God here is triggering for you, find the word in your tradition that helps you connect to the material. The point here is to connect to the alphabet word of the week, not to talk about who's wrong and who's right, because in all these words I'm presenting, they're presented in like it's every spiritual and religious tradition, most of them around the world.
I really love how you put it because I think that people are looking for some answers. And, I was not a very spiritual person either until some things were forced in my life.
Yeah.
And I found a spiritual solution to deal with that. But we all have a personal path. And I love that the practices that you're talking about is a way for people to find their own personal journey through spirituality that can help them heal, help them find happiness. And I'd love to know what your personal transformation has been through this
Mhm.
process.
Yeah. So my big personal transformation, it was partly through this class, partly with working through a coach, a relationship coach, but it was understanding the connection between childhood trauma, complex childhood trauma, and spirituality. And I've since studied that quite a bit more deeply because as I know now, what prevents me from and what was preventing me from being open to any kind of spiritual practice or being able to even practice anything and feel anything deeper was these layers of trauma that when someone first said the word trauma to me, I was like, what are you talking about? I haven't experienced any trauma in my life. I mean, it was such a foreign concept to me. And she said, "Hey," it was my coach, and she said, "Hey, why don't you take a listen to this podcast about complex childhood trauma? I think you would find it really helpful." And I listened. I still remember where I was, the exact moment in time where I was listening to it. Because it was like the clouds parted, and
Right.
I knew that this is what was going on with me. And the woman, she's a psychologist who was describing. It was maybe 3 years ago now, was describing the symptoms of complex childhood trauma and childhood emotional neglect and all these psychological terms that you hear and how they can affect you and how you can show up in your life. So basically, I had a really, and still do, it's a lifelong struggle with trusting myself. So it was really hard for me to go to a deeper place within me because it felt super duper scary. So it was really hard for me to go to that, to drop in to that place. I lived in a space that was very like, I'm a great doer. I can do things to the end of time. You know, I spent my career as a chef, like in the kitchen, being a doer is an amazing trait. You're like, all the things need to get done, bam, 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 bam. But as
Right.
soon
And
as the challenges,
that's a hiding
let's not,
mechanism.
exactly,
Yeah.
as soon as the challenges, let's not do, let's be, it's like frozen, deer in headlights. I can't do that. So I did a lot of reading about and took another course actually from Thomas Hubel called Trauma and Spirituality, which was an amazing course. He's an incredible person and teacher as well, and really came to just sit with my feelings, which I had never done before in my life. I knew I was a really sensitive and emotional person, but I didn't understand that there was a space where I wasn't being run by my emotions, that I could separate myself from my emotions. And again, that's the mindfulness part, tying in, being able to look at your emotions as something that are a part of you, but not are me. In my entire life, they've just been me. And I was so frustrated by why I was so up and down all the time. Why did I get angry really fast? And why was I really sad for a long time? And what's wrong with me? And I, you know, rather than accepting them as they come, being mindful of them as something separate from me and something that can be nurtured and kind of going from there. So that separation, which came from the things I just mentioned, the ability to separate myself from those through a lot of practice.
You know, I wonder too what you think about the practice of using spiritual practices for transformation within and the relationship that that has, you know, when we do it personally,
Yeah.
but the relationship that has for a global experience.
I think it is the only way to affect the global experience, to be honest with you. Like, it was a belief that I already had, but I didn't know it in myself. I just had always been, you know, if you want to fix out there, you have to fix in here first, because people who are injured in here are only going to put the hurt that's in here onto the world that's out there.
Yeah.
So, you know, my belief is that it has to start within you. And I have personally experienced change within my own life, just in relationships. The stronger I get within myself, and I mean more grounded, I'll say, maybe not stronger, but the more grounded that I feel, the more ability I have to feel the earth beneath me, the more able I am to affect the relationships and everything in my life in a positive way. But my breakthrough here was coming through the relationships in my life. This is where my kind of spiritual opening was through interacting with people. And the more centered and grounded I am, the more positive my interactions are with other people. The people in my life that are close to me and the people that I walk down the street in the grocery store, say hi to, cut me off in traffic, all of it, you know, it's just more positive. And I don't mean positive in that everything has to be positive, but I'll just say less frantic, more manageable. You know, I still remember one of the practices from this Alphabet of Spiritual Literacy course. I can't remember which week it was, but I practiced that week accepting everything that came into my life. And at the end of the day, being thankful for all of it, regardless of what it was. And I think it was the week on gratitude. And so that week, one night, I went through all the stuff that happened to me, and I'm like, I'd had a bad day. You know, I was like, oh God, I had kind of a bad day. What can I be grateful for? And I remember thinking, somebody cut me off in traffic, and I remember being, oh, I'm so glad that guy cut me off in traffic, so that I could practice patience, so that I can become more patient. And so, in that way, right? If we're more patient, it's helping the world around us to become calmer and more connected, I think. So it's funny how things work
Well,
that way.
yeah, and I agree, because I think that once we understand just how connected we are
Right.
energetically,
Yeah.
you go through your day and you have effect on people you don't even know. And, was it good? Was it a good encounter? Did you put out something negative? So I think that when we're mindful and we're conscious of a spiritual practice that is our own personal practice, that we can affect people better and we can live our own life better.
So I think absolutely, and I would say, and without having to have the other person believe or understand our spiritual practice. Like that was a big thing for me. There was a lot of codependency in my family. So I think I spent a lot of time not practicing because no one else around me did this in my like family of origin, right? And I'm like, okay, well, when are we gonna finally? I was like, oh, I have to pray for me, or I have to do my practice for me. And it doesn't mean that I expect it to work for that person or that person to even be interested in what I'm doing or any of it. It's very distinctly for me, and not in a selfish way, but in a way that nurtures myself and keeps myself connected to what I call source or the earth or God, however you want to say it.
Right. And I think that's the releasing of the attachment.
Yes.
We within ourselves do what is right for us in growth and healing and happiness. And it doesn't matter what people around us are doing.
And I think that can be, for me, that was one of the more challenging things and still is, to keep my daily practice going regardless of what's going on around me. If I have to get up early, if I got up late, if there's yelling in my household, if just whatever is happening in the morning in my household, the morning is when I generally practice, really taking that time regardless. Just even if it's sitting for 5 minutes, it's fine. Breathing, paying attention to my breath, that's fine. That all has to be, I think I had this image in my head that it had to be something really big, like a formal type of prayer. I'm like, oh, I don't know any prayers. Like, what does that mean? And I've since learned some prayers, which are great and helpful. But the thing that's been the most effective for me has been just focusing on my breath. And then from my breath, noticing my thoughts. And then from my thoughts, noticing my feelings that are coming because of my thoughts. And just noticing it. And for so long, I was trying to change it. And the practice becomes just noticing it without being ashamed of it or guilty because, I feel mad again. Like, oh, look, I feel mad. Okay. And to me, that was spiritual practice. It wasn't going to church. It wasn't doing any of these things, reading religious texts. It's just practicing being here multiple times a day. It's still the thing that helps me the most. If I'm ever like feeling overwhelmed or I have too much to do or any of it, I know that I need to just sit down and listen. And that's related to the sacred naming, actually, the practice that I was talking about.
Awesome. And you are going to do that exercise for us near the end of the episode. But I did want to just go a little bit deeper. The idea that spirituality and a spiritual practice doesn't have to be so formal. It doesn't have to be attached to a religion. It doesn't have to be, meditating for hours a day. That it's really something you can do as you go about your day. And that's what I'm hearing from you.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not necessarily like silence in the world around you, it's silence in your heart, right? Like a quietness in your heart. And you can do that in a loud space. Often it's easier in a quiet space to do that, but it's really cultivating. And in Sufism, it's called polishing your heart. So checking in and seeing what you need and seeing how you are able to nurture yourself in that moment. Give yourself more love. It's really what it comes down to. I think
And
we
it's so
subconsciously
simple.
spend so much, it's so simple. We spend so much time berating ourselves, having these terrible thoughts that we don't even notice. They're what we think is reality. And until
See,
someone
we're being
challenges us
fake.
and we're like, yeah, exactly. And then that's what I really had to let go of, was thinking as the ultimate mode of being. I only knew my main way of being was thinking. And so a lot of my struggle and was coming from overthinking. basically. I remember when I first started talking to my coach, she pointed out all the stories I would tell her. And they weren't fake stories, like they were things that happened to me. But she was like, I worked for her for 2.5 years. And after maybe a year or even 6 months, she was like, the main difference between when we first started together and now is that you used to tell me really long, elaborate stories about what happened between you and this person in the last week, right? And now you're not telling me these big, elaborate stories. And I was like, oh, wow. And her first in with me to get me to kind of change was to be mindful of my thoughts and how they were making me feel. And that's from for an overthinker, that was a spiritual experience, honestly, because I just didn't understand that there was something else. Like I thought the only reality was thinking. I never thought that reality could be in what I was feeling.
It does,
But
and to me, what I hear you describing is that it was a shift. And any
yeah,
time that we have some kind of an internal shift, it's a spiritual experience
yeah,
because I
yeah,
mean that's what we are.
right, right, absolutely.
I think we should bring this up a little bit, and that is the cooking, because you have been a professional chef for many, many, many
Yeah,
years, and
yeah.
you have a program that you run with people, about cooking, but also about spirituality, and you've kind of combined the two. Would you share a little bit about that?
Yes, it's really interesting that I've decided to do this. So, as part of my certificate in spiritual literacy, through this program I was talking about, we had the option to do a capstone project to basically become a facilitator of the alphabet of spiritual literacy. And I chose to do this and couldn't decide what I was going to do. Couldn't decide, and was really pushing away the cooking thing. Other group members of mine had said, hey, you should combine cooking and spirituality. And I was like, nah, whatever. I was looking to kind of get away from this cooking, this thing I'd done my whole life. But then a couple months ago, I gave in. I surrendered. And I was like, what's something I can talk about till the end of time? Food and cooking. I've been doing it for 25 years. And I do know and have recognized for a really long time that the best chefs are ones that are mindful of their senses. Because in cooking, you're using your five senses continually: your sight, smell, taste, touch, hearing. So they dovetail really nicely together, because I think in order to cook good food, or the best chefs that make the best food are incredibly mindful of what's going on around them at all times. So on the food side of thing, the businesses I've always had is teaching people how to cook, but very specifically teaching people how to make faster and easier homemade meals. Because the thing is that everybody's super busy. One of the first things to go is cooking, because they're like, I can't have it take 3 hours and I'm bored of the two things I always know how to make. So I'm not going to cook anymore. And so the way that I'm combining the two together is that I'm taking these words from the alphabet of spiritual literacy, just 9 of the words for this summer. It's a 9-week summer program. And I'm relating them to very specific things in cooking. So I started off with, the first week was with gratitude. And I talked about how gratitude is really the first step in cooking, because if you don't have gratitude, like literally none of this is possible in front of you. You have these ingredients, you have the ability to cook, you're hungry, you're grateful because you need to do something about your hunger. So just all these different things. I moved on to being present. That was last week. We're only in the 3rd week, and this week is listening. And I am a musician, have been for a long time. Listening is something that is really, I love talking about, and listening and cooking is absolutely fascinating. Like, you can listen to hot water and cold water sound different to each other, or if like your back is turned towards the stove and the onion in the pan starts to sound different, you know that it's time to turn around and give it a stir, that type of thing. So in my summer program, what I'm doing is presenting a little bit about the alphabet of spiritual literacy in light of how it relates to food and cooking. And then I'm giving a recipe at the end of each 30 to 45-minute session, but more of like a dish idea. I don't really cook by recipe. I teach people how to cook from scratch. So I'm giving them more of like, this is how to use your 5 senses and hone your senses so that you can more easily cook from scratch, so that cooking is easier in general. Because I think what really holds us up is oh, I'm going to cook, and now I need to spend 20 minutes finding the recipe that I pinned on Pinterest. We save recipes in so many places these days, but like we rarely have anything just, we don't trust ourselves to just walk into the kitchen and put together something that we have. Oh, I have some chicken. Oh, I have this. Oh, what can I make? And most people go, I don't know, I need a recipe. And what I'm teaching people to do is cook from scratch. And this summer program is basing on the mindfulness. And that, I don't know if I'll continue that, but I'm definitely going to go on with the summer program is here and open for anybody to join. But I will move on with the cooking from scratch for a larger program. And we'll always incorporate mindfulness because I love it so much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I love that because I rarely ever use a recipe. It's something that's been inherent in my whole family. My mother was that way,
Right.
I was that way, my son
Right.
was that way. And fast. I'm like the
Yeah,
fastest cook
exactly.
in
It
the
has
house,
to be
right?
fast.
Quick draw McGraw.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Love it.
So we talked, you mentioned this just a little bit ago, and that is that you have a little practice you're going to share with us called sacred naming. And
Sacred
I'm very
naming.
much looking forward
Yes.
to hearing this.
Yes. So, sacred naming is a practice that I got from one of my teachers, Jamal Rahman. He is a Sufi teacher based in Seattle. I've never met him in person. I've taken lots and lots and lots of online classes with him and been in his presence quite a bit in that way. And one of the first, he's written quite a few books. Any books by Jamal Rahman are amazing. He brings Sufism in, but then really ties it to everyday life. There are amazing books to learn more about Islam and Sufism. And one of the first practices he taught me is something, or taught the class, is something that's called sacred naming. And what he says to do is to think of a name for yourself that is a name that you can think of, maybe a grandmother calling you, a term of endearment, basically, is what he's looking for. So, something that when you notice that you are not doing well, say you're anxious or overwhelmed or upset about something, it's a name that you can call yourself in order to kind of bring yourself back home. So, I think his name for himself is Brother Jamal. I think that's his. And when I sat with that for a while, I came up with Sweet Aliye. I call myself Sweet Aliye. There's also a Turkish word. My background is Turkish. There's a word in Turkish called canım. It's like an endearment word. It means my soul, like literally means my soul, but it's just a term of endearment, like sweetheart or something like that. So if I'm ever feeling upset, or if I'm in a space where I want to drop in to myself, I always start with this sacred naming practice, which is just basically sitting, breathing, taking a few deep breaths, and then calling into your heart, discovering that what that name is for yourself. And the way that I first discover it, this is actually a little bit combined with another practice that he does, but picturing yourself in a room with people in your life that love you unconditionally. So surrounding yourself, like picturing in your mind's eye a comfortable, safe space where you are and where there's other people from your life. They can be alive or they can be dead. They're with you in the room. And these are the people that only want the best thing for you. And they are there in that room with you. And so in that space, it's just the ultimate safe space. And you're calling yourself by the name that you've chosen for yourself. For me, it's Sweet Aliye or Janam. And I'm basically asking what I need in that moment. So as I'm breathing and picturing myself in this really safe, surrounded space, what is it I'm upset about in this moment? And naming the feelings that I'm having in that moment. And that's actually more of a Buddhist practice. I kind of started to adapt this practice for myself. So as I'm calling myself by these names, I'm asking my sweet Aliye. Could be an inner child type of thing if you're familiar with inner child work as well. You're asking that sweet person inside what she needs. What do you need right now, Aliye? And she'll tell you. She'll say, I need to feel loved, or I feel scared, or why are you doing this? And you can slowly talk to the sweet person inside of you and kind of get a deeper understanding of what you need in a moment. And its ability to really drop into that space, that one that I was talking about before, which can be so difficult to drop into. And that practice really changed. That was my keyhole. That was my like opening to my heart. And that first time I did that practice, again, I still remember exactly where I was sitting, because I think maybe for one of the first times in my life on my own, I felt absolutely safe within myself. So that is something that came from him, stemmed from him, and then I kind of combine it with other stuff as I read books. But it's really just this noticing of yourself, being compassionate with yourself. And that naming, I think, naming of yourself really helps center yourself. That's what it was for me. And I picture it written on my heart or being said. If you can imagine the voice of somebody that was dear to you that would call you something like that, that can help. But once the name is there for yourself, then you have it to refer to. Nobody can take it away from you. You know, you have it to refer to whenever you want to. So, yeah, sacred naming.
That's beautiful. I came up with my name while you were speaking.
Awesome.
Something
That's
that
so
my
beautiful.
son used to call me. He would say, Madre. And we're not
There you go.
Hispanic.
I love it.
So that will
love
be
it.
my name that I will use in that practice. And I really appreciate you sharing that with us and all of yourself today. I think there are listeners who would like to know more about you. How best can they find you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have 2 social media accounts. One's food oriented, and the other one's more spirituality oriented. One is Soul Space Traveler. That's the spirituality oriented one. And the other one is Soul Space Chef. And that is Instagram, Facebook, all the places like that. But Soul Space is the thing to remember. And then
Right.
Chef, if you want more of the food. And Soul Space Chef is where I'm doing the food and spirituality on Facebook this summer.
I really appreciate you being with us here today, and hopefully we can have you back on the show in the future.
Yeah, I would love that. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Spirit Experience podcast, where we discuss spiritual practices for healing and happiness. Join one of our free online events live with me to discuss healing the whole person by connecting with spirit, releasing attachments, creating happiness, and living into your purpose. Links to reach out to myself and my guests are in the show notes. Have a joyful week, and I'll see you next Monday.